Okay. Um, yeah. So all this while we have been doing well, what I would consider introduction, classical machine learning, um, basics of machine learning with the likes of linear regression, logistic regression, then the classical machine learning methods which we use sklearn, right? So those are old ways. They are still quite um, they are still quite relevant now, by the way. So a lot of people think that the old classical machine learning methods are no more useful, but they have their own niche. They have places where they are useful. They have places where they will definitely perform better than neural networks or large language models or the modern technology. So it is a matter of having to choose the right tool for the job. And being able to choose the right tool for the job is something that requires your knowledge of how each of them works. But today we are going to start our journey into neural networks. Neural networks have been there for many years, as many years ago as any of the other methods, right? The only thing, right from when in the 50s, 60s, I think the first perceptron was done sometime in the 50s or so, right? So there was already the foundation, the theoretical foundation, the mathematical basis, which was taken after the human, it was taken after the human brain, right? So there was that. But it took a while. I think the neural network technology is the one that took the longest to mature and become useful. The interesting thing is that the AI that we use in the world today is actually a mishmash and combination of all of the different AI techniques that have evolved over the last 70 years, right? Or rather, I should say over the last, yeah, 70 years from the 50s till today. So we're going to look at neural networks. Yeah, today's models, most of today's machine learning models, all of the ones we talk about are built around neural networks. And so you can understand the interest and excitement, of being able to understand how these things work. Yeah, so this week we will look at that. We'll look at the internals. We'll take a deep dive into the internals, into the mathematical models, and we'll also be able to relate neural networks to a system of linear equations. Basically, think of it like linear regression that is unitized and scaled up to very large numbers. Um, and then after that, we'll move from the theory to actually implementing neural networks using PyTorch. We'll talk about the tools that we use because typically, with tools like sklearn, you can do a lightweight neural networks, but you can't do heavy lifting with it. The kind of things that we do in today's machine learning world, in today's AI world, right? We need heftier tools. So the likes of TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, and a bunch of other tools. So by the end of this week, you should be able to understand how neural networks operate, how they're able to process the data, how they're able to learn and maintain knowledge. Of course, it's the same way as all of the other ones, basically use of parameters. And then we'll be able to look at the how we train neural networks because they are multi-layer. You cannot just do a single training update for the weights or the parameters or the coefficients, for example, like in a linear model. So we'll also look at forward propagation, backward propagation, and then we'll do a simple feed-forward network using PyTorch. We'll go deeply into perceptrons. We'll talk about activations. So activations are the other thing that make neural networks very special, different from most of the other approaches. The activation introduces nonlinearity and therefore allows the neural network to learn nonlinear decision boundaries, very complex nonlinear decision boundaries, even though internally it is a linear model. But then you apply that nonlinearity, similar to what we did when we did logistic regression, where we apply a sigmoid at the end of the linear combination of weights and inputs. Then we'll talk about layers. What does a layer mean? Why do we even have to have layers? And then we'll start talking about training. So when we get into neural networks, you realize that it's not really about that. It's more about different architectures and it's about optimization. So we'll look at the different things. So yes, so here we go. Um, the question is, why do we even need neural networks in the first place? Why do we go beyond just using a linear model? Um, you know, support vector machines, decision trees. Decision trees are not inherently linear, but you know, can still be seen as linear models, right? So you have linear and logistic regression, right? Those ones can learn a single linear decision boundary, like we have seen. So when you use a linear model, the decision boundary, it can learn, it can only learn a linear decision boundary. If you need a far more complex decision boundary to be able to properly, classify or separate, then it will not do very good job, right? And that is where the whole thing ends with linear models. It just ends at the fact that in the real world, data is often nonlinear. Most of the time, in fact, you rarely see real world, real life data that is linearly separable, where you can just use a single linear decision boundary and you classify, right? Or multiple linear decision boundaries for multiple categories. Okay. So you find that linear models will struggle with complex patterns, with interactions between features, with hierarchical representation of relationships in the data, right? This is where the neural networks come in and they become powerful. This is where they come and they play their game. This is where neural networks solve those challenges. Because by stacking multiple transformations, you end up having a stacked combination of a system of linear equations, right? With the non-linearity, like I said, right? And that ends up effectively being giving them a capability to express nonlinear relationships and to learn nonlinear decision boundaries. So the second thing is, of course, you can learn nonlinear representations, and you can also discover features. This is another thing that we don't talk enough about often. With neural networks, each layer does a whole new set of feature engineering. So the neural networks are automatically discovering useful features on their own without need for human intervention or human discovery or human feature engineering. And that is why when neural networks came to the fore and came to the forefront of machine learning, that skill that we were calling feature engineering basically started losing its relevance because feature engineering really matters when you are dealing with linear models, with support vector machines, with you know, decision trees, random forests, and all of the other methods. But when you have a system that can learn its own features and in an iterative, continuous way, where a previous layer learns new features and sends that as a new set of inputs to the next layer. The next layer uses that and learns its output is a new set of features as well. So every layer of a neural network takes in inputs and gives out outputs. The inputs are essentially features learned by the previous layer, and the outputs are features it has learned. So you now have a situation where you have that, you know, continuous cumulative fine-tuning improvement of the input to essentially learn new and new features until at the tail end of it, the last few layers are able to get very meaningful features. And that is why, if you remember when we talked about embeddings last time, you find that embedding models, that's how they generate embeddings. It's simply learning the features on their own. So a neural network can also be seen as a function approximator, right? That is capable of modeling complex relationships. So when we say function approximator, what do we mean, right? A function approximator is a model that you can use and it will learn a function. A simple straight line linear model, y equals mx plus c, can be a function approximator, especially if that function is not a straight line, okay? If that function is curved, like you are trying to do line of best fit, the actual line is not a straight line, but your y equals mx plus c is a straight line. So it's approximating that function. It's not giving you the exact nature or relationship between the x and the y values. So that's what we call a function approximator. Um, data, the data, the features in a data set are related by a relationship, and that relationship can be expressed mathematically. Well, if it can be expressed mathematically, then it's a function, right? Where y, is a function of x. That's why y is called the independent variable, while x is called a dependent. Sorry, that's the other way around. Y is called a dependent variable because it depends on x, while x is called the independent variable because x is the raw data, and y is you know, the outcome of the different ways you combine the features in x. So if there is a way you can express such relationship as a function, right? Then a model that all these models we have been talking about are basically trying to approximate that function. And if the relationship is perfectly linear, then a linear model is a perfect approximator. So it's no more even an approximation in this case. It's an exact relationship. But what we say function approximators is it may not be able to give you the exact relationship, but it comes close enough that if you calculate the error, it is very low. And we find that neural networks are function approximators. And because neural networks are linear combinations of so many different, or rather are combinations of so many different units that are essentially linear models, right? Or let me even be, bold enough to say logistic models, because a single perceptron, a single neuron is just a logistic model. That's what it is. It's a linear combination of the X, which are the inputs, and the W's, which are the weights, right? X1, W1 plus X2, W2, and so on. X0, which is the bias, you could call it X0. You add it at the end. You sum all of those up. That's a dot product. And what you get is a dot product, or the sum of the product of weights and inputs, right? Then you take that result that you get from that single neuron or that single system of, or that single equation, basically, and you pass it through a nonlinearity, an activation function. So with logistic regression, we use a sigmoid function. That sigmoid function, um, is able to allow us interpret the values that we would have gotten in a wider range of real numbers into a very narrow range of 0 to 1. And as a matter of fact, that was almost kind of the original expression of a neural network or a neuron, the perceptron. So when you look at that, neural networks, when you now stack a lot of them, you can actually prove mathematically that it gives you a highly complex nth order, um, polynomial equation that has a lot of nonlinearity. So it can effectively model any kind of function. So it's a good function approximator. So the question now is, where did this whole idea of neural networks come from? How did the researchers and the pioneers in machine learning come up with this idea? They studied the human mind. They studied human brain, rather. The human brain, the biological brain. And the idea just came from the neurons in the brain. That's why we eventually ended up being called neurons. In those days, they were called artificial neurons. These days, nobody even really bothers to add the artificial anymore. We just call them neurons, neural networks, and so on. In those days, they were called artificial neural networks, and people still call them artificial neural networks these days as a way of separating them from the biological neural networks. So the inspiration there is the human brain is made up of cells called neurons. The brain cells are called neurons. The same cells run down your spinal cord. Actually, the spinal cord is a cluster of the tail end of those cells, right? That effectively allow parts of the body to connect to other parts of the body and forms the entire nervous system, the communication network of the human body. And these neurons receive signals, they process them, and they produce outputs. So when researchers looked at that, the idea came, oh, okay, let's see if we can model this and implement it in a computer. Because it looks like, okay, if we could model the human brain, then we can achieve intelligence, just like in the human brain. And that's how the whole thing came up. So we now have artificial neurons that also have inputs, and then they have the weights. So the inputs go across the weights, not really into the weights. They go across the weights, across the weights. So what we are effectively doing is we are taking the inputs. The inputs are the X, the matrix of X, and the weights is the W, the matrix of W, or the parameters. And we now have the weighted sum, which is X dot W. That's the weighted sum. If you expand that X dot W, you're going to get for every data point and every feature, if the data point is I and the feature is J, then you have Xij, Wij. You sum all of them. Well, you sum them on per data point or per sample. So for a particular sample, if you had features J from 0 to 10, it will be X0, W0, X1, W1, X2, W2. You take all of them, you sum all of them, and that gives you Y for that particular sample or data point. Okay. And you do that for all the data points. So it builds up. It's it accumulates effectively. Then that weighted sum is what we have been doing since with linear regression, right? That's what we've been doing. Multivariable linear regression. That's what that weighted sum is. But we now have the additional magic with neural networks. We bring in the activation. We're going to talk about activation. Activation brings nonlinearity. So you end up with this really simplified mathematical model. The human neuron in the brain, the human brain is actually more complicated than this. It's more complex. And if we wanted to try to represent it with a true mathematical model for it, it would have been more complex, right? But this simplified, just to show how powerful it is, this simplified model still works a lot of wonders. And that's what we're using in the world today to achieve all of the great things that people are talking about AI. So, one thing to understand is that neural networks are not biological simulations. In other words, they do not exactly simulate the human biological neuron or the animal biological neuron for that matter of any animal, right? They are effectively in today's, with today's knowledge, there is effectively engineering tools that are used to optimize for computation, right? Even though initially they started off like, okay, being inspired by the human neurons in the human brain, the neurons in the human brain. But we have seen now that the simple model we currently use for neural networks, artificial neural networks, are way, 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 way simpler. The neurons in the brain are far more complex. So effectively, what is now being used is the weighted signal combination. That weighted signal combination, again, the signal is X, which are the inputs, and the weights are W. And you have a weighted sum, which is X1 summation Xi Wi for all W, or for all X, which are all the features. And then you get the Yi, that is for a single data point or a single sample. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing that really makes it, powerful, like we said earlier, is layers. This is the concept of layers is one thing that no other machine learning model has. Um, you may find that models like the random forest have ensemble models, XGBoost. These are ensemble models. What we mean by ensemble is you are combining a lot of decision trees and you run them in parallel. Okay. Well, neural networks can have that as well, but neural networks are more of stacked in series. So think of if you wanted to do something like that with decision trees, it would mean we take one decision tree and the output from it, we send it as an input to the next decision. In fact, we take multiple decision trees, right, and form one layer, and then the output from all of them, we pass it to the next layer of decision trees, right? That's kind of what it is. So we keep the mathematical parts and the layer processing, but we don't worry about the chemistry of biological neurons because biological neurons are not triggered by electricity or math. They're triggered by electrochemical signals. So there's a chemistry to it. There's also timing, right? There's timing, there's pulsing, which we don't really factor in the artificial neural network models, okay, or the artificial neurons. And then the real complexity. So the reason why neural networks are successful is not because they are perfect at mimicking that brain model that initially was the driving or inspiring idea, but because they have become very efficient mathematically at solving what they do and highly trainable, right? In fact, the way neural networks operate, the artificial neural networks, is far different from, or the way they are interconnected is far different from the way biological neural networks are interconnected. In artificial neural networks, we have layers, but in biological neural networks, you don't have the layers. There's nothing like layers. You have clusters, right? And then the different, you have loops in the brain and all of that. Yeah, it's good to go check out some neuroscience so you can understand some of the things if you want to go deeper. Okay, so um, So the question now, what is a neuron? After all of this, a biological neuron is a nerve cell, a single cell, right? It's a basic unit of the human brain. So the brain is made up of neurons that combine to form, parts of the brain, which sometimes are called lobes. And then you have the hemispheres, where all the lobes come together. You have two hemispheres, left and right hemisphere. Okay. Um, then the way a neuron connects a brain neuron, the natural neuron, biological neuron, it receives other inputs from other cells, and then it fires output to the other cells. And that firing is a very interesting thing. It fires when a particular threshold is reached. Okay. You could also use that as an analogy and say that the activation functions that we have are an analogy of the threshold. But you also have a threshold of transfer of signal between a, you know, the output of one nerve cell and input of another, what we call synapses. So synapses link neurons together in the brain cell and carry information from one neuron to another. The synapse is, think of synapse as the connection between a previous cell and the next cell in the chain, right? The axon fires when the chemical potential in the neuron exceeds a certain threshold. So that's another interesting thing. So when I was studying this thing, some, 2 or so plus decades ago, um, they were telling us that the synapses, you can think of a synapses like the weights. So, or the resistance to the signal across. So if the resistance is higher, that means you have a lower weight. The resistance is lower, that means you have a higher weight. That is more of a signal goes through if the resistance is lower. If the resistance is higher, less of signal goes through. But even at that, when the signals come in, they pile up. So this is the chemical potential. They pile up and build up and build up a potential until that potential exceeds the threshold in the axon, and then it fires. That neuron fires. And when it fires, its output can then be sent through its own synapses, through its own axon and synapses to the next cell in the chain. Okay? So the human brain has a lot of neurons, and they are not all the same. They are different types, different shapes, different sizes, different characteristics, and all of this combine in different ways to form the advanced human brain behavior that, well, we know. Okay? You can see that average human brain has about 100 billion neurons. Okay, of course, in those days, this was a large number because we were like, um, hmm, you could not even match that. But these days, our large language models are coming close, even though none of them has yet reached the size and complexity of a human brain. We have parameters, but a parameter is not the same thing as a neuron, right? A neuron has a bunch of parameters in it, like the artificial neuron. So if you look at this now, this is kind of an image from neuroscience. You have the brain. The brain is made up of network of biological neurons that are interconnected. And then you have a single neuron. And then the single neuron looks like this. At one end, it has a nucleus. So you can see it's like it's a cell. It's like a cell. It's just like it's a highly specialized cell. It's not like other um, cells in the human body. So it has these things that look like um, small hairs or something. I don't know if I should call it that. Those are called dendrites. Okay. Then it has this long, somewhat spiny thing, right? That it sends signals down this long thing. It's called axon. The axon is covered by myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath also has a role to play in terms of potential and all of that. Then at the tail end, you now have the axon's terminal fiber, where each of these called dendrites, right? Um, can sorry, this called synapses at the end can connect to dendrites of the next cell. So at the head, these other things here, you can see you have dendrites. So the dendrites at the head of the cell receive signals from other uh, previous cells, right? Other cells that are connected to it, and from the synapses of those cells. When the potential in this cell is reached, the potential reaches the threshold, it can fire a signal down this axon that goes to the tail end and gets distributed out through the synapses at the end of this axon terminal fiber. That's how the human neuron works, basically. These are two more of basically different variants of the same thing. You have a cell body, you have a nucleus, you have dendrites at the head, then you have this long axon that goes all the way out. The myelin sheath was not drawn in this case. Then you have synapses at the end of the axon, which connects to the dendrites of the next cell. Again, this is just another drawing, same thing. The cell body is called the soma. You have the dendrites, you have the nucleus, then you have the axon, then you have the myelin sheath, you have the Schwann cell, the node of Ranvier. So there are some points that are where the myelin sheets kind of join, each other. And then again, you have the axon terminal fiber, and the synapses at the end. So that's biology, right? Now we move to the mathematical model that effectively tried to mimic that biology. That biology we have seen, by the way, is very highly simplified. There's far more things to it. If you go deep into studying how the human brain works, which is a field of study called neuroscience, right? Um, then you will be able to gain more insight. You find that there's far more to it than that. What are the things that transmit signals, across the cell? What are the chemicals? Like I said, it's an electrochemical process. So there are chemicals that do that. So what are these chemicals? So interestingly, some of these chemicals are what we now refer to as dopamines and things like that. But anyway, that's an interesting field to go look into. There was a time I actually did a bit of studying a bit of neuroscience, but that was a long time ago. So the mathematical model of an AN, artificial neuron, right? In the old days, the simplest form was what we call a perceptron. A perceptron is a single neuron, right? Of course, now there's a difference between what we call a perceptron and what we call a neuron. A perceptron was a mathematical model that implemented a very simplified version of the behavior of the human brain cell or animal brain cell. But you could still see that concepts were actually mapped. So, for example, the inputs, okay, in the biological concept, we have dendrites as the inputs. That's the point of connection to a previous neuron, right? Those are the inputs. So the dendrites form the inputs, right? Right here. They receive the connection from other. So you would notice if I were to do a network, for example, to this single um, biological neuron, what you would have here is you would have a whole neuron that will end up connecting one of his synapses connect to this dendrite. And then the other ones will go elsewhere and so on. Right. This is the cell and it has its own dendrites as well. And then you would also have where another cell would also connect, right, to this dendrite and so on. So every dendrite here would effectively connect to an entirely new cell, one of the synapses in a different cell. So that connection, those connections, that's what forms the very complex interconnection in the brain cell. Similarly, at the end of the axon, where you have the axon terminal fiber, every synapse also connects to a different dendrite, right, of a different new cell and passes its own signal downstream, right? You could have multiple cells, and it's not the entire cell, right? Just one dendrite. So this super complex thing is what makes is that network. So the power of the brain lies in the fact that everything is interconnected, not really in anything more than that. At least that's what we have been told, right? Okay, so when you now do a mapping of the biological concepts to the mathematical concept, you now find that the inputs are the dendrites, the weights are the synapses. Remember, the synapse is the point of connection between one cell and the next, right? As a cell is connecting to the dendrite of another cell, that point of connection is a synapse, and a synapse is effectively like a gap, right? That creates a kind of resistance or potential or capacitance, if you will, so that the signal, it varies, the synapse effectively varies how much of the signal from the previous axon or the previous neuron is propagated to the next neuron. That is what a synapse is. And that is why the synapse effectively maps to the weight. Because the weight in an artificial neural network is a measure of how much of this input signal, right, finds its way into the body of the neuron. So you can have a situation where the signal could be very large. Maybe the value of the signal is 5, and then you have a weight of 0.5, right? So what that means effectively is that the amount of signal that effectively comes in here is 2.5 from this particular input. So the weights act as synapses. They act as either boosters or attenuators. If the weight is higher than 1, maybe 2.5, that means it is boosting the signal kind of. So we'll now have 7.5 coming in here rather than 2.5. So the signal comes into the cell, into the body, right? The cell body becomes higher than the signal at the input. So by training, and the weights are the things that get trained. Similarly, in the biological neuron, the synapse is actually what learns. The synapse is the store of knowledge in the biological neuron and the biological neural network. As you are learning, your synapses are changing in structure and changing in effectively what we are calling weights. Then we have a bias, okay? So bias doesn't really have, um, well, the bias can be related to the natural predisposition of the cell itself. In other words, the cell already has a certain tendency, all right, to already trigger itself, right? It already has a tendency to trigger. Maybe it's already accumulated, or by nature it quickly gets to the threshold. You could also consider the bias as a measure of the threshold in the body of the cell. And of course, this point where we are doing the summation, you can see that as the body of the cell, because the summation here is you are now summing each of the weighted signals from each of the inputs. So you now have multiple weighted signals. They are far more inputs coming in from different, passing through their own version of the weights, WKI, right? And each of those eventually will get either boosted or attenuated. And ultimately, what you see in this is a weighted sum of the inputs across the weights. So you have a sum ultimately. That summing function, okay? So then the activation function, we now have in the artificial neural network a concept called the activation function. We'll talk more about the activation function. But the activation function kind of prevents an output from coming out until this weighted sum gets to a certain value. So you can say that the activation function kind of maps to the neural potential in a biological neuron, right? So once the input gets to that point, then you have an output that begins to be sent out, similar to how the biological neuron will get triggered and the signal will run down the axon and goes out to the dendrite, and then you have an output. So the output, of course, is the axon. That's what channels the output to the next cell or the next group of cells that that particular cell is connected to. So in the same way, the output here, right, is going to get connected. And unlike a neuron, you have an axon and then you have the synapses. So you have lots of synapses that spread out from the end, the axon um, the end of the axon, what we call the terminal fiber, right? At that point, you could also compare this to um, multiple neurons, even though it's, well, this is where we have a little bit of difference, right? Because in the biological neuron, you can have multiple outputs, right? Well, in a way, it is so because you can still take the same output here and you can connect it to multiple inputs in the next layer, multiple neurons, in the next layer. But the main difference is that for purposes of simplicity and ease of understanding, we most times just have a single neuron, a single artificial neuron having just a single output, not having multiple outputs. So the way the neuron works is what we have been doing right from the beginning of this class. We take each input, we multiply it by its weight. When we were doing linear regression, we were doing it like that, x1, m1, right? Or m1, x1. And we were summing it, right? All the way till we got to xn, mn, where n is the number of features. And of course, we have x0, right? Or you could just say m0 because x0 is always 1. That's the value of the bias. Okay, so you take each input. So this is each input effectively forming a single feature. So you can now understand why in a system like this, where you have multiple inputs, each of these input is seen as a single feature. And you can understand why later on when we talk about layers in the neural network, why each layer can be seen as doing feature engineering, right? It's engineered feature. So then you now have the summing function that sums the results. So these results are then summed. And then the bias term is added. So the bias term is representing kind of already predisposition of that cell to being triggered. So you can think of it as a potential, but bias is a really good word for it. And then activation function is applied. So when you think of it this way, you see that conceptually, a perceptron computes a weighted decision based on the input features. So each of these inputs represents each of the features, right? And each of the inputs is weighted, right, by the weights as it comes in. And then the sum is computed. So it's a weighted decision. It's a weighted sum of the inputs. Okay. And remember, it's a weight that you are learning. That's what the model is learning when you are training it. It's effectively is learning the weights. So that's what an artificial neuron is effectively. And once you have understood that simple model, it becomes very easy to understand everything else about it. So again, this is just repetition, right? A different way of looking at it. A perceptron is the simplest form of a neural network unit. Again, remember, a perceptron is just a single neuron. It has inputs x1, x2, x3, all the way to xn. Each input has a weight. So this is just another way of looking at it. It's basically the same thing. Here, the inputs were in green circles and the weights were these big circles. But here, the inputs are these circles, while the weights are the lines, the edges that connect each input into the central body. I think I prefer this one because you can then consider the input as nodes and the weights as edges. But in representation, it's not even done that way. It's just a matrix. In representation, we're going to look at those matrices. So you can see that this is effectively a logistic model. This is what we did with logistic regression. This Z is the intermediate sum, right? Which is achieved in here, the summation WIXI over all the N features, right? For a single, whichever data points that you want to use. And then all of that is passed through this function F, which is the activation function, right? This function F is so little here, it's difficult to see it, but F is the activation function. It's a non-linearity. It is this, right? So Z is a dot product plus bias, right? The bias is kind of inherently here, and you can actually just think of the bias as another input, but the value here is always 1, right? And that input is going into this, and the bias is the weight. It's also a parameter, so it's learnable parameter, but the input is always 1. So that means the bias is always there. Unlike the other ones where the weight might be high, but the input is 0, has a value of 0. So no input is coming in. So again, these are just different ways of representing the same thing. Of course, the output after the sum is the y or y hat in this case. So we've been calling it y hat or this y. So it's the same thing, right? X is the input vector, which is all of the values for a single data point. Or if you extend into a matrix, all of the values, all of the features for a single data point, if it is a single vector. But if you now turn into a matrix, then each row in the matrix represents a separate sample or data point or data sample. So you now have a input matrix that is made up of samples and the features of those samples. Then the W is the weight vector, of course, which effectively what it does is to when you do a dot product, that's what gives you the weighted sum, and then the bias, and then the activation function, which we'll talk about later. So multiple ways of looking at the same thing. This and this are basically the same thing, they're equivalent, right? And then the output, the final output is taking the weighted sum, whether you are looking at it in the non-vectorized format, which is this one, or the vectorized format, which is this one. And then you take that output and you pass it through the activation function. So when you are training a perceptron, you're effectively just modifying the weights and the bias. That's what you're doing. You're just modifying the weights and the bias. Now, again, remember, a perceptron is just a single neuron. We have not yet gotten to the point of neural networks yet. We're still talking about just a single neuron. Okay, so now the question is, what is now the difference between a neuron and a perceptron? And this is very critical and very key for us to understand. Perceptron was one of the earliest models, as early as the 50s, 1956 or thereabout, that it was proposed to represent a single layer neural network. And again, this is where the whole modeling after the brain, inspired by brain's neuron, started from. But the first difference is that in a perceptron, what we just had was a binary threshold. A binary threshold, was it greater than, was a value greater than that threshold? If it's greater than threshold, then you take the output to be 1. But if it is not up to that threshold, then we take the output to be 0. It was as simple as that. So the inputs to a perceptron was always either zeros or ones, and the outputs were also always either zeros or ones. One of the limitations of that was the fact that it wasn't very good in solving a lot of problems when you limited its expressivity to just binary, effectively, binary values. And I can understand why the initial researchers and scientists, computer scientists, chose that binary, because it would have been much easier to implement in computers of those days, because computers were already binary. So if it were possible for us to use perceptron to solve problems, computers would do them much better, because you could just use a single bit to represent a cell in that case. Okay. And it would be much, much easier um, to achieve the computational the scaling we needed at that point. But unfortunately, in the real world, that binary idea was not very it wasn't very helpful in solving a lot of problems. So we'll talk about that later on. So we had strictly binary threshold units and adaptable weights. Well, the weights could be adapted to any number, right? But the inputs could only be binary, right? 0 or 1, and the output could only be binary. Inside, you would have a weighted sum. So because this is binary, effectively the weighted sum is just a sum of the weights that have been activated, kind of the weights that have non-zero values. In other words, the weights that the inputs are 1. You just add those weights. So you can see how much easier it was doing the maths of that of perceptron. The maths of perceptron quite simple, was quite simple to do. You just added the weights, that had values or had inputs of 1, and then the bias as well. So that's still the same thing. It's still the summation and weighted sum of weights and inputs. That gives you the intermediate Z value. Then you now have a threshold. So that threshold was fixed. I don't know. I think it was fixed. Um, Perhaps you could, by based on the model or the architecture, you could choose a threshold of 0.5 or 0.7, similar to what we did with logistic regression when we're trying to determine what um, the actual prediction is. So if Z is okay for perceptrons, what was done was, if the value of Z was greater than 0, then the output is taken as 1. Okay. But if the value of Z was 0 or less than 0, then we take its value to be 0. And it was simple to implement, but it wasn't very useful. The neuron, on the other hand, over years, much, much later, the neuron was developed to solve a lot of the challenges that perceptrons had. And the neuron, same model, right? The only difference is that the inputs were not restricted to being only zeros or ones. The inputs could be any real number. It could be any number. It could be 0.5, 0. It could be any number. So it gave the capability to express a much more continuous range of inputs, of internal states, and of outputs. And of course, the outputs too were not restricted to being zeros or ones. Rather, an activation function was applied to introduce that nonlinearity. So those were the main things. The neuron employs nonlinear activation function, right, to introduce nonlinearity, while a perceptron just employs only a threshold activation function. So threshold in this case is it's either 0 or 1 once it crosses a threshold. But for neurons, the activation function could give you other values, not just 0 or 1. It could give you non-zero values that are above 0, above 1 even, and all kinds of things, or even below 0, depending on what you selected. Then the output of a neuron is not necessarily a binary number. Like I said, it could be a real number, but the output of perceptron is always a 0 or a 1. And The third thing, which I don't really think it was the architecture of perceptron, but more of the technology and knowledge of that day, was that a perceptron, you could only have one perceptron, right? What we call a single layer perceptron, a multi-layer perceptron. If you wanted to have multiple layers, it was difficult to calculate the weight updates. It was difficult to train the model because you had to manually calculate the weight updates. Okay. So for a perceptron, you had to have a fixed formula. If effectively for perceptron, a formula was derived that was used. So it was a fixed analytical formula that was used to train the model. So to train the model, um, that algorithm is what we call the perceptron algorithm. Okay. So the difficulty with that was that if you change architecture, you have to derive a new algorithm for training the model. And as the model gets more complex, the algorithm also gets even more complex. So if you wanted to stack multiple layers of perceptrons, you would have to derive a very complicated, I don't know if anybody actually was able to derive a an algorithm for calculating the updates, the weight updates, right? For a for multiple layer perceptrons. Okay, so that's why it was challenging. It was not practicable. It could not scale. It was clear that it could not scale. If for every new model you have to build, you have to sit down and do a mathematical derivation or use some kind of algorithm, you know, a specific algorithm for a specific model. Each model had to have its own algorithm, right? So that's where the neuron basically went ahead because with neurons, one of the key things that was discovered was the backpropagation algorithm, which is interesting. It's still an algorithm. In fact, sometimes I wonder, I've not done that experiment yet, maybe I will, is couldn't we now use today's backpropagation algorithm on perceptrons? What would happen? And then we could have multi-layer and then use gradient descent, which is what we use for optimization. So neurons of today are composable with other neurons. You can combine them, horizontally, you can combine them vertically to produce a far more complex network that can approximate even more complex functions. And that is where the power of modern day neural networks lie. One of the challenges that led to that discouragement in neural networks or neurons, perceptron specifically of the old days, was the fact that perceptron could not solve the exclusive OR problem because the exclusive OR problem is not linearly separable. And so you cannot use a linear model to solve it. But the perceptron was a linear model. In order for you to achieve rather a model that was nonlinear, you would need to stack two or three perceptrons, you know, to form at least two. You need to stack at least two, maybe, or maybe three. There's an exercise we are going to do where we'll show some of that, right? But a single perceptron, even a single neuron, by the way, cannot solve the exclusive OR problem because a single neuron is also it's a linear model. It's just like I said, a single neuron is essentially a logistic regression. The only thing is that a logistic regression where the output function, which is a sigmoid function, you can replace it with any other function, which we now call activation functions. And by the way, sigmoid function is one of the activation functions. So the neuron is the smallest computational unit of a neural network. It's basically an abstraction for a relatively simple function. Example, a sigmoid that will be composed with other simple functions to produce a more complicated function, which is typically nonlinear. So what's essentially happening is that instead of us mathematically, it helps us to have an intuitive understanding. Like I say, you can actually take a complex neural network and you can come up with a system of mathematical equations to represent it. But that will be too abstract and difficult to intuit and understand. So by then going this approach of neural networks, where a neural network is a single unit that holds a single mathematical function, basically a single logistic regression, then it becomes very easy to intuit it and to think about it. And then if we compose lots and lots of these, we don't need to think about it. It's more intuitive to understand how combining multiple of them gives us what it gives. And that's the power of the neural network. It's not really the fact that the neural network was some special invention. Again, the neural network it's a complex system of linear equations. But it's the fact that somehow it was able to represent it, but decompose it into units of simple equations that we can understand and reason about. That is what makes the whole neural networks a powerful concept. Okay, so again, like I said, perceptron is a decision boundary, right? Both a single perceptron, a single neuron. Like I said, the only difference between perceptron and neuron is the nature of the inputs, the nature of the outputs, and the nature of the threshold function or the activation function. Perceptron inputs are always zeros or ones, binary. Outputs are always zeros or ones. And the activation function is a step function, basically, right? A threshold function that if it is less than zero, it's zero. If it's greater than zero, if the intermediate sum is less than zero, then the output is zero. But if the intermediate sum is greater than zero, then the output is one. Okay. While a neuron is continuous, so inputs can range from minus infinity to plus infinity, right? And the output can also range in the same direction as well. And you have the activation functions. So what we are talking here applies to both the perceptron and the neuron. Perceptron is a single straight line, right? So in a 2D plane, you can see that the line that the perceptron predicts is a straight line. Well, the intermediate value anyway, the Z, not the actual output, which has the nonlinearity applied to it. But even in that, right, even with that nonlinearity applied, with that step function in a perceptron, it is still going to be either 0 or 1. That's what classification is, isn't it? That's what logistic regression is. You calculate an intermediate value for Z, and then if that value is above a certain threshold, then we take it as true. But if it's below, we take it as false. That's the decision boundary. So effectively, that's what a perceptron is. Perceptron is a logistic function. A neuron is a logistic function. So in a two-dimensional plane, if you were to plot, like two features like this, X1 and X2, while the classification is a color, right? And you could say blues are false and reds are true. Then you draw a decision boundary. You can train this perceptron to draw the correct decision boundary. This is the wrong decision boundary. But because it is linearly separable, you can actually train a neuron to adjust itself, update its weight until it draws the correct line. Okay. In higher dimensions, this decision boundary, of course, becomes a hyperplane. We talked about hyperplanes when we were talking about the support vector machines. In 2 dimensions, the decision boundary is a straight line. In 3 dimensions, it is a plane, a single flat plane. In dimensions above 3, 4 dimensions and above, it's now what we call a hyperplane, which is effectively a plane that exists in a multidimensional space. Okay, so the classification rule that you typically use would be on one side of that hyperplane, class 1, you have predicted it as class 1 or classified as class 1. While on the other side, so on this side of this hyperplane, which it's effectively reduced into 2 dimensions, this is class 1, right? While on the other side, it is class 0. So on this other side, this is class 0. So we also predict that this is class 0. Okay. So the perception decides based on the sign of Y pred. And what this means effectively is that in a perceptron, the Y value, like we said, if the Y is greater than, if the Z rather, if the Z, which is the intermediate value, if the Z is less than or equal to 0, then it goes to negative classification. While if it is above 0, right, then it goes to positive classification. So you can see that a perceptron is a simple decision boundary. Same thing with a neuron. And that's why we took a lot of time to study um, all of those basics so that it will be easier to understand this. So the question, I've said this already, is one neuron or one perceptron is not enough for a problem that is not linearly separable. The key limitation with a single neuron or a single perceptron is that it can only learn linearly separable problems. So problems that you can draw a single straight line and you can classify. This is not such a problem. This is the exclusive OR problem, and you cannot classify by drawing a single line because of how it is on this plane. You need two lines at the very minimum or a curve. So in some cases, for example, when we did this with support vector machine, well, you could draw a, a circle, which is not a line. And you could say anything inside this circle is the blue class or category, and anything outside this circle is the orange class, right? So you needed a nonlinear decision boundary here. The alternative is for you to draw two lines. But remember, a decision boundary has to be contiguous. What contiguous means is that you cannot draw two separate lines. It has to be a single line. So even if you were to see a line, it means that somewhere, if you expand it out into an infinite space, you would still be able to see where those lines connected. So for example, if I see a single straight line here and another straight line here, these are two straight lines. There should be only one decision boundary. There should be only one line. So somewhere in far into the infinite space in future or in space, there has to be a point where these two lines connect. Okay. So anyway, classical exclusive OR problem, there's no single straight line that can separate these classes. So a single layer, a single neuron cannot solve this. And that is what one of the things that was identified by researchers immediately. The perceptron model was invented and people tried to use it to solve so many different kinds of problems. And that was the first disillusionment that happened with neural networks, and why neural networks did not pick up much in the early 50s, 60s, and even in the 70s. Okay. We talked about all of that at the beginning of this course when we were talking about AI winters and all of that. It's because of this particular problem. There were other problems. When eventually neurons were found, were invented, and multi-layer neurons or multi-layer networks, perceptrons, what we now call multi-layer perceptrons, were invented, the next problem was the computational power to actually solve those things in real time. So anyway, the solution to this was if we could take a single, instead of using a single neuron, right, let us combine multiple neurons into layers, right, and then combine multiple layers, right, into nets, deep networks, okay? Then we can solve the problem, and that's basically what happened. So now you could then create what we call a layer. So you have a single neuron, right? But if you take two neurons together, that forms a layer. And then you could call this the input layer. And then you have another layer that is also made of neurons, maybe another two or three neurons, right? And then you can then interconnect this. So this neuron connects to every other neuron in the next layer. And then this other neuron also connects to every other neuron in the next layer. What we now call a fully connected network. And each of these connections has its own separate weight. So you have W1, W2, W3. If I have W from here to here, W from here to here, and so on, right? You can now see how it's getting complex to, if we wanted to represent this as a system of linear equations, you see that it's getting complex. But we can easily think about it when we are thinking of them as neurons and layers of neurons. And that's what happens, right? And then we have something we call hidden layers, where you could also have a layer in between, right? So you could have input And then you can have the hidden layer, and then you can have an output layer that could be made up of another two neurons, or maybe just a single neuron. And then every um, neuron in the previous layer connects to this single neuron. Of course, you also have the weights here, W1, W2, W3. And then you now have the final output from this neuron. Okay. You have the inputs into these ones, right? This is now what we call an MLP. So when you hear the terminology MLP, it means a multi-layer perceptron. So that terminology perceptron still somehow remains, even though these days MLPs that we have are not binary, right? They don't have only zeros or ones, right? We actually have them as neurons that have values in a continuous range of from minus infinity to plus infinity. Okay. But we still retain this terminology multi-layer perceptron to represent a neural network, the simplest form of neural network. So we are going to talk about single layer and multi-layer perceptrons shortly. Of course, these multi-layer neural networks, that is what revolutionized everything, because at that point, it became clear that with a multi-layer neural network, you can solve this exclusive OR problem, because a multi-layer network can learn a non-linear decision boundary. It can learn in fact, not just a non-linear, really complex decision boundaries, really complex decision boundaries. The large language models that we have today, you can see language relationship between, words and in sentences in language are complex, very non-linear, but large language models have learned all of those things. So they can learn to classify through very, very complex decision boundaries. Okay, so let's talk about activation functions. So why do we even need activation functions? You could say, okay, are these activation functions not just bringing additional complexity, right? Why? You know, why do we even need activation functions? So, the main reason why is if you do not, you can actually prove this, right? That if I were to take a stack of neural networks, which are already linear combination of weights and inputs, and I were to take a stack of them, right? I can actually prove to you that if I take a neuron and connect it to another neuron, right, without an activation function, right, where this neuron N1, you have the input and you have the weight, and then you have the weight W1. If you even just look at this, just let's use a very trivial example with one input W, with one input X1, okay, coming into this through this weight W1, and then the output of this, we can call it A1, right? Or Z1. I would call it Z1 because it's kind of still the intermediate. But typically in neuron terminology or notation, we use A to represent the output or activation. Even though technically it's not, we are trying to look at a case where there was no activation function. So we could have called it Z1. In fact, let me call it Z1. Okay, so let's assume that we have X1. So we have Z1 here coming out from this. And Z1 is basically X1 W1. Basically X1 W1 or X dot W, a dot product. And you pass this into another neural network, another single neuron through another weight. Let's call this W2. Okay. And yeah, this could be N2, the second neuron. Okay. So I have two layers, N1 and N2. I have two layers. What would this output look like? You can actually prove, and I think I have a slide that shows this later on, which we will look at. But you can actually prove that um, W2, the output from here, Z2, okay, is actually equal to W2 times Z1, right? So Z1 times W2. That's Z2. I remember that Z1 is what? X1 times W1. So that will give you what? X1 times W1 times W2. And you find that the output here is still going to be a linear combination. Yeah, I use a single point here, but if you use multiple features and you do this calculation, you find that at the end of the day, Z2 is still going to be a linear combination of X1 and all the stack of weights here without it. So you are still going to end up with a single, it will all simplify to a single linear equation, a single linear transformation. So you are still going to end up with a single linear decision boundary. And we'll still go back to the problem of effectively multiple neurons, layers of neurons without any activation function can be remodeled as a single neuron without any activation function. So effectively, it is still going to be incapable of learning a nonlinear decision boundary and will not solve the exclusive OR problem or anything like that. So without an activation function, a neural network simply becomes a stack of linear operations. And you can prove mathematically that that stack of linear operations can simplify into a single linear transformation. So you see, end up with the same thing, right? So that is why activations came into place, because with an activation introduces a nonlinearity so that you now have an output here, A1, right? You now have an output A1 that is that is a kind of nonlinear transformation, right, of this Z1. So you have A1, it is a nonlinear transformation. And we're going to talk about what those transformations are specifically, right? A nonlinear transformation. This nonlinear transformation makes it impossible for this stack of neurons to simplify into a single linear transformation. And that is why we call it a nonlinearity. Already, if you even look at the curves, you see that these are nonlinear. It's not a straight line. It's not a straight line. In fact, the only activation function that will still result in a linear transformation is this last one, the linear activation function, where the value of x, the value of the output is basically the same as the value of the input, or some constant times the value of the input, right? That's a linear um, activation function. And it has its own purposes. There are some places where you don't want to do the nonlinear transformation, right? But of course, there will be subsequent layers that will now have nonlinear transformations, so that will not have this problem of collapse into a single linear transformation. So that's the purpose of activation functions. With that, our models can then learn complex patterns because they can learn nonlinear decision boundaries, right? And our models can approximate arbitrary functions for regression problems, right? For classification problems, they can learn complex decision boundaries. For regression problems, they can learn to approximate any function, any arbitrary function. You can actually prove mathematically that with a group of neural networks, you can more or less come close to, you can approximate any arbitrary function. It's more of a question of how many neurons you put together and how you stack them. Okay, so the key idea here is that activation functions can actually determine what a neural network can represent. So you have different ones. You have the tan, which is hyperbolic tan, and hyperbolic tan will have zero values of 1 at this upper end and -1 at this lower end. So this helps to kind of limit the value. So the values are in that range of -1 to 1. And it helps you when you are, trying to address or handle the output. Okay. ReLU is another type. ReLU means rectified linear unit, right? So explain why it's called a rectified linear unit. It's basically a straight line. But if you think about electronics and transistors or diodes, diodes are used for rectification. So rectification with diodes, if you, for those of us here who have done electrical engineering or electronics, right, this is a symbol for a diode. And this symbol actually is an arrow with a line this way. I didn't draw the lines very straight. Maybe I should try to do that much better. But um, effectively, this is the symbol for a diode. And that symbol is saying current flows only in one direction. In the positive direction, it will allow current to flow, right? So the output will be exactly the input. That's rectification. But in the opposite direction, so in this direction, whatever is coming in here, Z, right, is also what will come out here, Z. But in the opposite direction, okay, when you reverse the direction of the current, it blocks flow in the opposite direction. So in the opposite direction, the value here, of course, is minus Z because it's opposite direction, but the output here will be zero. I don't want any current to flow in the opposite direction. And that's what this graph means. So it means that this line, when X is positive, okay, the output is also X. But when X is negative, then the output is always zero. So that's why it's called rectified, because it kind of follows that principle of rectification. Okay. So it's called a rectified linear unit. That is what ReLU means. Um, Rectified linear unit. Rectified. So that's what the RE is, a rectified, and the LU is the linear unit. So you see a lot of LUs when you come to activations. You see a lot of LUs. Various variants of these linear units. You see CELU, GELU, SWIGLU, all kinds of LUs. We'll talk about that. There's actually a video I'm going to show you. I'll share after this class so that you can understand the ideas behind activation functions. So we also have a sigmoid. We encountered sigmoid initially when we did the logistic regression. And if you remember, sigmoid also limits your value to 1 at the upper end and 0 at the lower end. So it forms a kind of probabilistic probability function, because probability is not supposed to be higher than 1. And it's not supposed to be lower than 0. You cannot have negative probabilities. So sigmoid becomes very useful for such kind of logistic. That's why it's called logistic, basically. You're dealing with logics, and it's probabilistic. So you get values that represent probability. And you can see the equation that is used for it is 1 over 1 plus e raised to the power minus x. And I showed you how this was derived, the piecewise combination, or rather the step, how do I call it now? The step-by-step transformation of the EX exponential function to end up looking like this. And then of course the linear, which is not really, it's called linear, it's not non-linear, but it's still an activation function and it's useful in some cases. There are far more activation functions than this, but these are typically like the first few ones that you encounter, and historically the ones that have been used a lot in the past, in history. Okay, so let's look at it. What is an activation function? We can see that in biologically inspired neural networks, the activation function represents the cell potential, right? The rate of action potential firing in the cell. So there's a certain maximum, there's a certain threshold that the cell potential needs to exceed before an electrochemical current is fired down the axon to the synapses that will connect to the cells that follow, that particular cell, right? It's a charge system. It's charge, basically, electrochemical charges. So it keeps accumulating as signals are coming from the input. It keeps accumulating until when it gets to a certain threshold, then it shoots out, right? So In the simplest form, you can think of it, it's a binary that is in the perceptron. So either the neuron is firing or not. Okay. Neurons also cannot fire faster than a certain rate. This is in the biological context. Now, that rate of firing is one thing that has not been modeled in our own artificial mathematical models for neural networks, for artificial neural networks. Okay. Even though a few new work in research is ongoing now to figure out how to do that. Not figure out, it has been figured out, but implementing it. But the simple model we have now is so good and still sufficient that it would take a bit for these newer models to kind of surpass them. So in the mathematical model, activation functions do the same thing as the biological neural network. They allow the neuron to activate only when the linearly combined input, that is the Z, is at a certain level. You can already see that here, like when we were talking about ReLU, the value here needs to get to 0 before it activates, otherwise it remains at 0. For negative values, that this a neuron that you have ReLU as its activation function will not fire until the Z, the combined weighted sum, you know, or inside the cell, inside the neuron, the internal value rises above 0. And you can look at the same thing, for the tan and the sigmoid as well. It depends on what you call firing. For sigmoid, it has to be above 0.5 for us to consider it, firing. Or 0. Well, it has to be, X has to be above 0 and it will fire, right? Tan, the same thing. Well, above 0, it begins to fire, but it's still going to have a value that is very low. So you see that in all of this is always the concept of a threshold, a minimum value below which the output from the cell is going to be quite low. And that is what activation function tries to do. So that is what introduces the nonlinear behavior, right? The nonlinearness is the fact that it does not activate until that threshold. So the behavior is nonlinear, right? A linear behavior would be it activates according to whatever input comes in, which is what the last activation function is doing. Whatever input comes in, it sends it out direct without any resistance to it. But that is what brings the nonlinearity. And it's that nonlinearity when compounded across many neurons that allows these neural networks to learn nonlinear decision boundaries and approximate any kind of complex function. So the reason why they are called activation function is obvious. If the threshold is exceeded, the signal will be passed to the next neuron. So the neuron will be activated. In this case, the artificial neuron will be considered as being activated, right? But if it's not up to that value, then it's not activated. Activation functions are important because they give that neuron the ability to only be activated if the presented input is meaningful. So what this means effectively is that the neuron will learn how to respond to inputs that are meaningful. It doesn't respond to every single input. As you are training the models, you are adjusting the weights at the input, right? The activation function kind of modulates or influences our learning process in such a way that that particular neuron will only light up and say, hey, when a particular combination of inputs that's interesting to it based on what it has learned becomes available. Okay. And these are the most widely used. There are many more than this, right? You have a sigmoid, like we've already seen. Sigma has output range of 0 to 1, like I've said. It's historically popular. It has been used for many years. And it's probably the very first activation function that was used after the perceptron. The perceptron used the threshold, which wasn't really a function, but it could still consider a step function, right? But after that, when the improvements came, the sigmoid was the first that was used. And it can be interpretable as a probability because its value is always between 0 and 1, which is the range of standard probability. Okay, and you can see the shape here, and the equation is 1 over 1 plus e raised to the power minus x. Then you have the tan, which is a hyperbolic tan, right? Its output range is from -1 to 1. So it can never be lower than -1, and it can never be higher than 1. And it's zero-centered. That's the main advantage it has. It is symmetric. The fact that, negative inputs will have negative values that are symmetric with positive inputs that are similar. So that is very useful in some situations when you are training models to be able to understand both negative and positive signals. Okay, and then we have the ReLU, the rectified linear unit. The output value is always going to be maximum of 0 and z. Max of 0 and z means if z is negative, then max of 0 and a negative number is always going to be 0. So that gives us 0 always for negative numbers. But if z is 0 or above, then max of 0 or a number higher than 0 is going to be that number. So you always get that number. The main advantage of ReLU is very fast and efficient. You are not doing any mathematics, unlike the sigmoid, where you are doing some extensive mathematical calculations, or the tan, where you are doing some extensive, exponent. Exponent is a really um, expensive operation in computers, right? Because it's a combination of multiplications and divisions, and divisions are one of the most expensive um, mathematical or arithmetic operations in a computer. Seconded by multiplication. Addition and subtractions are much easier to do. So, because the exponent function is expensive, it takes a long time relatively to calculate the exponent of a number, especially if the number is growing larger. And the tan also uses exponent. Another way of expressing this tan is 1 plus 1 minus e raised to the power x over 1 plus e raised to the power 1 minus e raised to the power minus x over 1 plus e raised to the power minus x. Essentially, the term was derived from sigmoid because sigmoid wasn't symmetric enough, right? So you can see that when you check the history of activation functions. So at the end of the day, sigma and tan take a lot of time to calculate, but ReLU is just an if statement. In fact, the max is, well, okay, you could consider an if statement, right? Or you can just consider it, hey, is this thing greater than 0? That's an if statement. And if it's greater than 0, then take the value. If not, take 0. So it's very fast to calculate, and that's one of the biggest benefits. You can train your model much faster if you use ReLU as the activation functions, and it's most common in the hidden layers because of that. ReLU does have a few challenges as well, especially the non-linearity, the not non-linearity, the discontinuity at 0. It is not differentiable as 0. So because there's a discontinuity here, and you cannot find a gradient at that point. So the way you solve it, if you wanted to solve it, you would have to have a gradient just before and a gradient just after that point, right? So and the other problem was the fact that there is no stimulus, in the negative direction. That was a problem. So the leaky ReLU was brought up to solve that. Leaky ReLU is just a ReLU with a small negative value. A small negative value for negative, a small output, negative output for negative values. So effectively, it's you are using 0.1 times x, which for a negative number, it will be higher, right? 0.1 times x will be higher for a negative number. It will be higher than x for a negative number. But for a positive number, it will be lower. So you kind of get the same kind of thing. Then you have a bunch of others. You have max out, you have ELU. There are many others. You have CELU, you have GELU, and so on. A lot of them, the ELU is a combination, exponential linear unit. It's a combination of, ReLU and essentially trying to bring some um, continuity at this point of 0. So when the value is high, or when the value is positive, you use the value of x. But when it's negative, you use this exponential um value of essentially using alpha, which is a measure of how much how much of how much components that you allow in a negative direction. So yeah, so that's it basically. You can see all of this. Then okay, is EZ minus E raised to minus Z over EZ plus E raised to minus Z. This is the tan function. The sigmoid, which we already know, the ReLU, which we already talked about, the leaky ReLU, which is just the same, the Z, whatever comes in, you send it out, but in the negative direction, you attenuate the signal a lot. So what comes out in the negative is much smaller. Um, so the sigma and tan will tend to saturate because they have a maximum value. No matter how high the input, the output never goes above 1, or -1 for tan or 0. It never goes below -1 or 0 for tan or sigma respectively. Rarely is piecewise linear. Piecewise linear means you have two pieces of the curve of the graph. You have the piece on the negative side, which is just a straight line, and then a piece on the positive side. Well, it's still a straight line, but it follows the 45-degree slope. For leaky relu, there's a bit of a small degree slope in the negative direction as well. So that's why it is piecewise. So let's talk about how do the gradients of this. I mentioned a few of that a little bit earlier on. Activation functions work better, right? Some activation functions work better in some situations and do very poorly in other situations. So the choice of activation function that you use actually depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. It's very, very key. So for example, you have what we call vanishing gradient problem. When the value of the signals are very large, right, the gradient begin to vanish. That's what you see for large Z, right? Sigma and tan will shrink for large Z. So because at that point the curve is flattening out. So it results in very slow learning in deep neural networks because the parameters will, if the gradient is very small, then the change to the parameter will also be very small, especially considering that you'll be using low learning rates as well. Okay, so that is a challenge. ReLU has the advantage that it does not have vanishing gradient in the positive direction. It converges faster, therefore it converges faster because it does not have vanishing gradient. It also has the advantage of simpler and faster computation, like we said. But ReLU has this problem of dead neurons for negative inputs. Remember, negative inputs, the value of ReLU will be 0. So those neurons will keep remaining dead. They'll keep having no output, no output. And when they don't have any output, that means they also will not have any gradient. So the parameters on those neurons or going into those neurons will not get updated because the function is always 0. The value of the function is always 0. So the solution to dead neurons was the leaky ReLU, which you saw, where there's a little bit of a signal in the negative direction, but it's very small, right? Just trying to balance that, but it's still non-linearity, so that helps. So when you're choosing activation functions, here are some guidelines. First of all, for hidden layers, use ReLU, right? By default, because it's faster, it's easier to compute, and so on. Use leaky ReLU if you start having a lot of dead neurons. Dead neurons are neurons that continue having 0 activation, no matter what happens, and they never change. So that means you have to look at internally the activations in your neurons. Output layer, for output layer, use sigmoid if you're doing binary classification. Remember, sigmoid has 0 to 1, which is what we use for logistic classification. Logistic regression rather is still binary classification. So 0 values will give you the negative class and 1 values will give you a positive class. But if you're doing a multi-class classification, use softmax. We'll talk about softmax later. It's also an activation function. And then if you're doing a regression problem where you are trying to predict an actual number, don't use any activation. That's where you now use that linear one that we talked about, where everything that is on the input you pass it through to the output. So you see that we use that for regression problem, but only on the final output layer, not all the other layers in between. Because if you use it in all layers, then you would have that problem of collapse into a single linear transformation. So the choice of activation function that you use for a particular neuron or a particular layer depends on where the layer is and what task that you're trying to solve. So that's very important to take note of. So here's the final mathematical model of a neuron based on all we have discussed. You have the input x0 coming in for a particular data point, right? And then you have W0 rather, which is the weight that determines how much of this input goes in. And of course, that how much is determined by W0, X0. So you can think of the XO as the axon from the preceding neuron. And then you have the synapse, and then you have the dendrite of the current neuron, right? That takes that in. And then you have the cell body. And then you have a bunch of other dendrites coming in as well with their own values, W1X1 and W2X2. And the cell body sums all of this, right? Sums all the inputs from the different dendrites here. And then after summing it, um, there's a bias as well that is added, which is kind of the tendency. Think of it like if this sum of think of it this way, if the sum of signals here was water that you are pouring into this cell body, the bias is a measure of how full the cell body was before you started pouring water into it. So if it has a high value for bias, it means it's already kind of filled up a bit. So you only need to put in a little water for it to hit the threshold that will trigger it. But if it is low or zero, that means um, you have to do more work. And if it's negative, well, that means it probably has a leak, which you have to fill up, right? So think of bias as a predisposition that the cell already has. Okay, and then this weighted sum, which is a z, you now pass it through f. F is the activation function. So the output is now going to be weighted sum wix1 I rather plus b for each I being each of the inputs, and then you pass that through the activation function, and that forms your output. And you can compare this model with this, where you have dendrites, the nucleus, cell body, impulses carried, the axon that is triggered and fired once the internal cell potential has been achieved, and then it goes to the axon terminals, the branches of the axon, where you have the synapses that connect to the downstream cells. So this is one. I have another one here, basically the same thing. It's effectively the same thing, right? Input weights. This time around, we are looking at weights as the edge that connects the input into the cell. The bias comes in also as a separate input. With the weight is the bias itself, while the input is always there. That's why it's 1. Linear combination gives you a Z, and then you pass the Z through the activation function and get the A, which is the activation for this cell. And Y hat is basically the A. So that's a single neuron. Like we say, a single neuron, in spite of all of that, still is a linear model. So it cannot predict a non-linear decision boundary. You need multiple neurons for you to be able to predict a nonlinear decision boundary. And there are many ways you can combine neurons, but the easiest to implement, right, is the concept of a layer, right? And a layer is basically take a stack of neurons and put all of them together and treat all of them the same way. In other words, in a layer of neurons, they will all have the same activation function. They all share the same inputs, and they all have outputs that go out, right? So that makes it easier from a computational standpoint to manage than if we were to try to do each of them one. It also works in the context of current computation that we do with the current computational devices we have, accelerators, GPUs, and so on, that are able to handle multiple, what we call SIMD, single input multiple data, or single input multiple computation, right? So you can parallelize all of that maths and do it faster. That's why the layer concept is preferred rather than trying to have maybe each of these neurons doing a different thing. It will be very, very difficult because you have to do separate, imagine having to do separate activation function for each of them and separate computation of the activation function. It will be very difficult to parallelize such such things. So the benefits that we get from um, considering all the neurons in one layer as a single unit is more efficient computation. So a layer is just like I said, a single perceptron can only compute one linear jump boundary. By the time you combine multiple layers, you can then combine multiple perceptrons. In this case, we are combining them horizontally, even though this is drawn vertically, but I see it as horizontal because the three of them are side by side doing the same thing. You will have the same inputs coming from each of them. You have the same inputs, and then you also have the same outputs. So, um, so that's it, right? Um, and then the next one is also another layer, right? So you also have the output as another layer. Even though in this case, the layer has just one neuron in it. Okay, so a layer can have any number of neurons. You specify by specifying the number of neurons you want to have in that layer. So a layer is a collection of neurons operating in parallel. In other words, the computations are done in parallel. They are not dependent. They are not interdependent. Again, that gives us the benefit of more efficient, faster computation from a pragmatic computer engineering standpoint, right? Each neuron has its own weight and bias. So that's the parameters that we talk about. Okay. All neurons receive the same input vector. So they all receive the same vector, which is this same X vector, right? That same X vector is now going into each neuron. So it's what we sometimes call a um, we call it a fully connected system. So each vector is applied to the three neurons, right? This vector is applied as input to this neuron. Let's say this vector has whatever number of values or inputs in this is in this vector. All of them will be applied as inputs to this, applied to this successively, but not in sequence, not in series, in parallel, all at once. Okay. And then so that again is for efficiency of computation. So based on this, we now have different types of layers. So you have what we call the input layer, which is a layer that just receives raw input features. And then we have hidden layer, which is a layer that you place in between an input layer and an output layer. So the hidden layer, they can be multiple hidden layers. They learn intermediate representations. And then the output layer. The output layer is what produces the final prediction. So you can see that the layers now become the building blocks. So even though we have neurons, right, but layers become the building blocks for the expressive neural networks that we have today. So what's the input layer? Let's look at each of them one at a time. The role of the input layer is just an entry point for data, right? The key characteristics of the input layer is that you have one neuron per input feature. So each neuron represents, in the input layer, each neuron represents a single feature. So if you have 12 features in your data set, you have 12 input neurons, or you have 12 neurons in your input layer, okay? The input layer also does not have any trainable parameters because its job is just to pass input through into the neural network. So it's not trained, it doesn't need to be trained, right? It doesn't have any parameters. And it also doesn't have any activation function for the same reason. Its job is just to pass input from your data set, okay, from the features in your data set into the entire neural network, okay? So it will receive those raw feature values, it will pass the data unchanged to the first hidden layer. In fact, in some situations, you find that you don't really need an input layer at all. Just pass the data set straight into the first hidden layer. But then because of this interconnectivity thing, right? In some architectures or in some um, neural network frameworks, you still have to create an input layer. Okay. So examples of how you map data into a neural input layer, a neural network, is if you have tabular data, then you know that each row represents a single data point in your data set, a single sample. In that single sample, each column represents a feature. So each column will get a neuron assigned to it. So each column will get a neuron. Okay. If you are doing image, for example, image recognition, then you're going to take the pixels in that image and you flatten it out and stretch it out. Um, and then each pixel will be assigned to one neuron, right? And that's what we call channels because, well, not one neuron per pixel or channel. For channels would be if you had a color image that has 3 channels, RGB. Okay, that's if you're using a flat, fully connected network. Later on, we'll talk about convolutional neural networks that are used for images. And then if it's a text embedding, right? Remember, we just talked about embeddings. Embeddings are vectors that represent meaning, and it's a multidimensional vector where each number represents a feature that has been learned. Okay, so each of those numbers, one of it will be represented by a neuron in the input layer. Okay, so the input layer defines the shape of data. It has nothing really to do with the model's intelligence. It allows um, you to know how many, what the shape of the input should look like, or the shape of data should look like. Okay, then we have hidden layers. So the hidden layers are the ones that create meaning and internal representation of the data while it is being trained and after it's been completed, training has been completed. The hidden layers create new feature spaces effectively. Every hidden layer generates a new set of features. That's how neural networks work. And the way to think about it is um, when you are doing um, when you build a multi-layer perceptron, right? You have each layer corresponding to the number of features that you want to deal with. So, like we said, the input layer, you choose the number of neurons in the input layer to match the number of features in your input data. But after that, you are no more constrained to matching the number of features in the input data. You can add more neurons in the next layer or less. And typically, you find that the hidden layer normally will have more neurons than the input layer because you want to extract even more features. So think of it as now feature engineering, except that you are not the one doing the feature engineering. You have a layer here. Let's say this one came with 3 features, right? Um, X1, X2, X3, or eye color, you know, um, hair color, and maybe what else? Um, height. Let's just say that. So those are 3 features. But you can see the hidden layer. We may want to do feature engineering. Think of it like feature engineering. We've now added an extra new feature that is derived by combining these previous 3 features in a specific way, right? And we also derive a second feature here that is also uh, by combining these other 3 features in a specific way. And the combining is, remember, this is you have weights that come between the output of one neuron and the input of another neuron. That's the weights, that's the synapse, right? So you have weights here, you have weights here, and you have weights here. So what you have is a weighted sum of this, and the weights are learned by the network.
So by the time the network learns the weight, then what comes here will be a different value for what it learned. So it effectively learned a new kind of feature, right? So in the process, this hidden layer has learned 4 new features. Of course, the number of neurons in a layer, you determine it when you are building your model. Okay, so you can add more, you can add less. But at the end of the day, you find that your model has learned new set of features. It's feature engineering. Each layer does feature engineering for the next layer. And the output from this hidden layer becomes um, new set of features for the output layer. The output layer doesn't do feature engineering. It just gives you the prediction. So effectively what's happening in a neural network, in a multi-layer neural network, is each layer does feature engineering. The output layer ends up getting refined features that it can work with, that are like the best for it to use to predict what it is being asked to predict. That is what the essence of multi-layer architecture in neural networks is. That's how you can intuitively think about it. So effectively, the hidden layers transform the input space. They change the nature, you know, effectively just see it as feature engineering. So you can now have a situation where after doing this transformation, the a a set of features that were not linearly separable before can be engineered to become another new set of features that are linearly separable. So that's what this means. You could end up, right, with neural networks being able to achieve a new set of features that still work well and represent the old set of features, but are now linearly separable, so that the output layer can then easily classify with a linear decision boundary. This is what is really happening in the hidden layers. The hidden layers are basically transforming the original features that are coming into the input layer into another new set of layer features that are easier for the output layer, which is still a linear model, to do the um, to to calculate its decision boundary. So that's another intuitive way of looking at it. Of course, the other way you could look at it is the entire stack of things can result in an equation that is non-linear. So it gives you a non-linear decision boundary. So the way you could look at it is, here I have 2 examples. I have one with a single hidden layer, and I have another one here with 2 hidden layers. If you want to look at the exclusive OR problem, for example, the first layer will create intermediate features. Those intermediate features um, will then be combined into separate classes. So you now have a new set of classes, and then the output layer, or even where you have a single hidden layer, right? Then the output layer is able to draw a clear decision boundary. So think of it the same way a support vector machine was able to use a linear decision boundary, right, to classify objects in a plane by projecting them into hyperspace, right, where a different plane ends up with a linear decision boundary, right? But that's not the same thing as happening here, but you can think of it that way. It's essentially re-engineering the features, essentially transforming the feature space, right? So in a different space or a different set of coordinates, right, in that multidimensional space, you actually are able to separate them with a linear decision boundary, right? And neural networks become really good at that. So what the activation functions does in this whole thing is it helps to bend and fold and reshape that input space into a place, or where the linear decision boundary can actually separate, right? So it enables nonlinear decision regions. So you can see that the other interesting thing is that in the process, a neural network is not just classifying the data, it's actually changing the way the data is represented. It re-represents it And that's what we mean when we say representation knowledge. The neural network actually learns its own internal understanding or representation of that knowledge because that's what it is able to use to do that task that you gave it, that classification task. Those are the hidden layers. And then, of course, finally, the output layer. The output layer now produces the final prediction because by the time the signal gets to the output layer, you now have features that have been re-engineered in such a way that the output layer can easily classify it, right? So some of the key characteristics of the output layer is that the number of neurons in the output layer will directly match the task. So if you are doing a binary classification, you just need a single neuron that will give you a high value for the positive prediction and a low value for the negative prediction. So you can use a sigmoid activation function for that, as you can see here, right? So you have the input layers and then you have the hidden layers that are doing the transformations into a new set of features that now go into the output layer that does the linear combination of that transformed set of features and goes through the sigmoid. But if you are doing a multi-category, a categorical classification with multiple classes, right, then you would use a softmax function. Okay, so the activation function you choose depends on that. The number of neurons also depends on the task. If you are using multiple categories, you would have to have one neuron for each category. So you end up with something that you could say is one hot, even though the output in this will not really be one hot, it's more of softmax. We'll talk about that. But what that means is that the particular neuron that is assigned for a particular category is the one that will activate most when it thinks that that category is the correct prediction. Okay, it will activate. It will have a high activation value, but all the remaining ones will have low. So, for example, if you're trying to classify whether the color of a petal will be green, red, yellow, or blue, that's four classes, right, in that category. So you would have four neurons in your output layer. And then one of the neurons will be assigned to blue, one will be assigned to red, one will be assigned to green, one to yellow, or whatever colors are. So when it thinks the output is likely yellow, the one that was assigned to yellow will have the highest activation. Okay, so we use softmax to normalize those activations to a range of 0 to 1. That's what softmax does. So the number of neurons depends on the task, like I've mentioned. The activation function is also task dependent, again, like I've also explained. And output layers would normally give you interpretable output. So typically, if you are doing a regression problem where you want to predict a single number, you can use one neuron, no activation, like I said, because you want to pass it through. If you're doing a binary classification, you have one neuron with sigmoid activation, like I've explained. And for multi-class classification, you have n neurons where each neuron represents one class in that category. And you use softmax so that you can normalize the output to a range of 0 to 1. So the output layer is the one that now translates the internal representation or the learned internal representation of the knowledge to something that us, the trainers, will be able to understand. So the output layer translates the language of the neural network to the language of the uh, label data that was used to train it. So at this point, I'm going to stop here because we've run out of time, right? Um, there's a lot more to talk about. So we'll talk about types of layers. We've talked about the different layers. We've talked about input, hidden, and output. But then we also have what we call fully connected layers and all of that. So we'll continue and discuss that. And then we'll talk about feed-forward neural networks, what that means, and how we put it all together. So the neural networks is a, a broad course, but it's also very intuitive. It's one of the reasons why I like it so much because it's easy for you to understand the operations. And we're going to see some of the animations here of how they operate. So I will pause there and we will resume on Thursday. Are there any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, we'll see. Have a great evening.